Hi everyone. Well, thanks so much for joining this Walt ID webinar about blockchain and the role it can play for decentralized identity. I'm joined today with quite an amazing array of experts from around the field, people working on blockchain, people working on decentralized identity solutions and SSI and those use cases, as well as the business development side. So maybe I'll start by introducing our esteemed panel. We've got Sylvia Aran from Polygon ID. She's the BD lead. We've got Alan Horvath from EBSI, who's leading the architecture work there. We have Eike Haas from IOTA Foundation, who's the identity lead, and that's covering all things technology and blockchain. We've got Nick Reynolds from Veramo. He's the kind of product lead at Veramo Labs, a kind of multi-platform working on credentials and DIDCOM and so on. And we've got Dom from walt ID. Thanks so much for inviting us, Dom. And walt ID is a kind of open source SSI solution used all over the world. So let's jump in. And Alan, I wanted to start with you. You know, what I don't want to do is jump straight into the kind of what is blockchain. But you know, many of us have been working around self-sovereign identity, decentralized identity, and we have conversations with others and say, well, there's a blockchain. And a lot of people kind of then say, well, you know, why do you need a blockchain? Or, you know, what are the challenges you've been facing or questions you get about why you need a blockchain for identity? I wonder if we start there.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Jamie, for the nice introduction. I think most projects, we have projects coming from two different directions. On one side, there are projects that say, okay, we have blockchain, we have this great technology, let's see what we can do with it. So it's like they see it as a tool and they're trying to find a problem. But on the other hand, we see that the digital identity space is evolving for decades, so it's not new. There are many challenges and we still haven't found a way to really solve the problem and have like this digital identity ecosystem that would enable like seamless authentication, identification, or at the end of the day, like secure and reliable information exchange. So major challenges here are always, first of all, whether or not blockchain should be used as part of a solution that in the digital identity ecosystem. And if yes, where and what are the values and benefits of such technology? And here I think we need to take a look from a different perspective, not starting from technology, but from actual like business problems. So what is digital identity and how to scope it? And we can observe like two different directions of evolution, which is completely technology independent. So on one side, we see trends where groups or communities try to establish a single identity, and that single identity should be recognized by all ecosystems, like all the governments, all consumers. On the other hand, we know that digital identity by nature is contextual, meaning that, you know, as a company will have in different contexts, they will have different identities. Like they have like IBAN for accounting, they have their business identity for business in the business registries. They have their domain names. They have their signing and e-sealing keys, and essentially in each of these like domains or like contexts, this digital identity is different. So there are these two now approaches, and well, at least as we see it in other projects and other domains, it's probably more natural to have an ecosystem where an entity can attach like or maybe like combine multiple identities from multiple domains and then presents the one that the verifier or relying party will understand when verifying the information. But how can blockchain, where can blockchain help, right? I think that's always the question. So first, we need to go back and rethink what we learned from blockchain. So blockchain itself, when introduced, basically is really solving the double spending problem, and that's at core of it. And then later some additional capabilities were added, and essentially you can perform some operations computations on the blockchain, but essentially the idea remains the same. But one thing that came with it is the fact that information becomes easily verifiable. And this really leads to a question: is it possible to establish a framework on an ecosystem where information is expressed in a manner where everyone can verify it anytime? And of course, in order to do this, you would need a solution that can keep track of information, that has high availability, it's reliable, and it's cryptographically secure. And basically, once you jot down all the business requirements, you always have you have several options, of course. I mean, there are many ways to solve the problem, but one can quickly realize that blockchain as a solution has many properties that are desirable for such a solution. And I mean, if one would just say, okay, we don't want to use blockchain for various reasons, would end up with a solution that would be probably very similar to blockchain. I mean, at the end of the day, we know that many solutions, many databases use basically the same consensus protocol as permission blockchain network. So essentially, I would say there are multiple ways of basically meeting the business requirements for such an ecosystem. But I believe that really what is important, and we see more and more, is to have a capability to express the information in a reliable way, and I mean in a transparent way. So once this is possible, it is quite easy to, I would say, establish an ecosystem or a framework where everyone can verify any information. Because as already discussed, today, machine-to-machine information exchange is happening usually within a given domain or within a given use case. Whenever we try to exchange the information outside of the domain boundaries, well, this usually results with a Word document or a PDF or an email. And if we sign the PDF, I think it's already quite advanced. And that information cannot really be verified. We simply trust the source, trust that information. And this is really constraining our everyday experience. I mean, for example, if you consider how much time you spend to get a digital document or driver's license or any other identity document, or how much time it takes to perform a transaction or enroll somewhere, that is not just log in with XYZ. You actually experience. So we do experience this inability to exchange information cross domain. We can experience it on a day-to-day basis.
Oh, apologies. So it sounds like the tooling that technologies that the organizations using today are not fit for purpose. To be able to share data across a boundary, blockchain can be helpful to provide that trust. And you mentioned something interesting there about gathering the business requirements and therefore being able to handle some of those at a blockchain level. And Ike, I know you've got a kind of perspective around whether they can be separated and if there are trade-offs. Maybe that's something you could touch on.
Yes. Yeah. First of all, thank you, Alan, for the overview. And I think I agree with your perspective and the also interesting take, right, that the fundamental property of double spend prevention isn't that critical actually for what we do, right? Because the identity controller is well defined in most cases, right? So concurrent access is not really that common, right? It's a great property to have, but I also agree that the fundamental interesting property is probably safety and global availability, right? And to some extent, also decentralization plays a role if we talk about the availability, right? Because high centralization, hyperscaler DNS infrastructure getting knocked out takes down a couple of zones, and then, well, it wasn't a couple of zones, but it still was centralized enough to take down all the availability that you relied upon. But I think what Jamie is hinting at, and is a point I'm quite passionate about, is considering the different implementations of DLT and the implementation capabilities that translate to usability or even security guarantees that technology built upon carries forward, right? So if your DLT is fundamentally very secure but quite expensive, that translates to direct usability effects, right? Because then creating identities on that DLT, paying for the storage, paying for the rent, however, whatever system you use, right? It might be fees, it might be rent, translate to usability. And the same goes for the fundamental security. And if we build layers on top, which we need to do to get adoption, right? The fundamental security implications of the underlying DLT might be so obfuscated that people don't even have an idea how centralized that system actually is, how likely an Eclipse attack might be, right? And I think that it's important for us to consider that the base layers need to be interchangeable from an interoperability perspective, but they are not interchangeable from a guarantees perspective, right? And many of the guarantees matter that we design on the fundamental level. And those might be different depending on the use case, right? Some use cases, I'm thinking public transportation, right? Ephemeral identities might maximize for super low transaction cost, almost free transaction cost, and not care so much about decentralized availability globally, right? Might not care too much about the fundamental security, right? Some base level of security is desirable, but they might not be too worried that like a multi-billion dollar Eclipse attack might succeed, right? That's probably good enough for public transportation, if that makes sense. For other use cases, governmental identities, organizational identities, the story is different. Maybe it's okay if it costs $30 to register. It's not great, right? But maybe that's the right trade-off.
And I think that word trade-off is really important, right? So is this about availability? Is it about portability? Is that expression minimum viable centralization, right?
Yes.
Where can we get the maximum utility while still, building privacy, scalability? And Nick, you're deep into the Ethereum ecosystem, right? And enabling SSI tools across different flavors of Ethereum and roll-up networks and so on. And I'd love to hear your take on what interoperability means to you and how you think about those trade-offs, right, against availability and scalability. While many people building on decentralized Ethereum networks, maybe it's all about super private, right, and anonymity. Mm-hmm. So how do you think about those trade-offs and the Ethereum ecosystem?
Yeah, so just to go back in time, maybe like 5 or so years, the team that I'm on used to be called the Uport project and was responsible for developing one of the first real blockchain-based DID method, DID Ether. And the thought behind it was that there are some situations where publicity of certain information is really important, and like Alan and Ike said, availability of that information is really important. If I have a public encryption key because I want to do end-to-end encrypted communication with people, I need a good way of sharing that broadly, the same way that I share my email address. And so the team developed DID Ether to address that. Again, this was 5 or so years ago, and so it was deployed to Ethereum mainnet. Obviously, some huge challenges coming with that, primarily on the transaction cost side of things. Yeah, it would be great if we could all update our DID documents on Ethereum mainnet when we want to for free, but that's not really how it works. So in the ensuing years, the same DID method contract has been deployed to a bunch of different Ethereum networks, roll-ups, as well as private and permissioned Ethereum networks. I think you're right that it just really depends on the use case. Yeah, security and transaction cost are a huge trade-off, and absolutely a lot of times you don't really need that availability as much. In fact, a lot of times you go all the way to that direction and you don't want to use a blockchain based DID method at all. You could just use something like DID peer for sort of one-off communications. But when you have something that's like my public persona, whether it's my real life identity and I have credentials associated with it from my government or whatever, or it's just my public facing persona like my Twitter or my X account. I need that to be public, and I need everyone to be able to say, oh, this is when he added that encryption key or that signing key. So all of these messages, yes, that is really from him.
And again, just thinking about, you're talking about different persona, right? And before we were talking about different use cases having different requirements, and them kind of manifesting in how you might architect the blockchain layer. And maybe Sylvia, I bring you in at this point because Polygon ID is got a Web3 focus, and expressly building on the Polygon ledger, she's thinking about rollups from Ethereum. So maybe we can abstract away some of the what people might perceive as drawbacks with kind of Ethereum in terms of speed or gas fees or whatever. So maybe you could talk a bit about how Polygon ID thinks about building identity on top of a ledger when it's not the kind of the base Ethereum level ledger, but maybe a layer 2 or above.
Yeah, so the solution we are developing can run in every EVM compatible blockchain. So that means also the ones on layer 2. That helps to reduce any costs needed at the point in time that what we call identity states need to be published on that blockchain. And also resolves the scalability issue, right? So actually the identity project that initiated the protocol that is being used now for Polygon ID actually was initiated in 2018, and the developers decided to stop the project at that point in time because they were having issues with the current scalability and the costs of the Ethereum blockchain. And then they started developing actually what is nowadays the ZK EVM, no? So they actually started using the ZK technology to develop the solution, the scalability solution that is nowadays being offered under Polygon, and then they retook the identity project back again. So as you see, the blockchain, also the type of blockchain you are using, it can be limiting, or the other way around, can be fostering the solution. And I need to say that we depending on the use case, you are going to probably need to use a permissioned blockchain or a permissionless blockchain. There will be certain use cases, mainly with some more traditional institutions that most probably would like to go into more permissions, although you lose part of the nice characteristics a blockchain brings, which is this decentralization and possibilities to really make data available across multiple people, right? But I need to say also that decentralized identity solutions can run also without a blockchain, right? And we need to have this also clear in mind, that not always a blockchain is needed to run a decentralized identity solution. But whenever you might need, for instance, to cover use cases that require revocation of credentials, probably the use of the blockchain is the most adequate, right? Or rotation of keys, or that's where the use of a blockchain could be needed. We have been faced with certain use cases that we have been discussing, where we wanted to provide identity to people that maybe nowadays don't have even an official ID document given, or they have but they lose it, and so maybe we are talking about camp of refugees, right? And in there you also need to keep in mind that not always in these environments you will have the best access to internet, and then the best access to a blockchain. So you also need to build systems and decentralized identity systems that might be supported or still work without a proper internet connection and a proper blockchain technology, right? So you need to cater all different kind of use cases. There will be the most common ones, the ones that you are familiar with, where this is being used for KYC purposes, and then probably that's going to run easily on every blockchain, right? But there are others that you really need to be very, very cautious on what will be the underlying technology used to implement the use case. Yeah,
it's so fascinating how the kind of principles of decentralization and citizen empowerment and portability are now showing up in the different ways we're thinking about building really the application layer that relies on different technologies like blockchain. And I think there's a couple of things I want to pick out there. One is about, really, this is a kind of mixed economy, right? Consumers don't really care about this stuff. Citizens don't care about how it works, but they need it to work. They need it to be available, to be secure. And so, maybe this is a point to bring Dom in, because we're going to be living in a mixed economy, a bit like the payment networks, right? I need to be able to use different payment tools in different contexts, maybe different jurisdictions. And so Dom, how do you think about, really solving for the customer need, the citizen need, when they don't care about which blockchain it's anchored to or if there's a blockchain at all? And maybe walt.id's perspective on how you abstract that away from the user?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, maybe starting off with an interesting realization that I got from listening to each and every one of you. I mean, everybody here in this panel is either directly working on a specific ecosystem or blockchain, or is deeply immersed in an ecosystem. So one may have expected people to kind of shill their solutions or say that one blockchain may be better than the other. But what happened instead is that people are talking about the real world value as a direct consequence of having different use cases, and this realization that different use cases have different requirements. So consequently, what we need are potentially different technologies, like different blockchains that have to be used to address those challenges. And I feel like that's really a consensus across this panel. So what we're really looking at is a multi-blockchain, a multi-ecosystem future. And we've heard that basically with everybody saying this using slightly different words. And I think Jamie also summarized this directly. So I think that's really a fascinating realization that everybody here agrees upon and understands that there's different technologies that are used for different use cases depending on scalability, cost requirements, compliance requirements, and privacy, and maybe other aspects even. So coming back to your questions, what do we do for consumers, for businesses, and for developers? I mean, at the end of the day, blockchain is a rather new technology, and the same is true for all the decentralized technologies that we see emerging, which can be, self-sovereign identity, NFTs, SBTs, mobile driver's license, and whatnot. At the end of the day, the consumer doesn't really care. It has to work. I think that's what you said. And so I think at the end of the day, more or less the same is true for the businesses and developers that we're working with. They just want to make sure that they have a solution that works to implement their use case, be it in public sector, education, employment, banking, supply chain, healthcare. There's so many different requirements that you have. And so I think it's just so important, going back to a point made earlier, that we make sure that we have interoperability across these different networks, that we have tooling built for developers and businesses that make sure then that if I'm building a solution for a specific vertical, for a specific consumer-facing problem or business problem, I can just leverage the advantages of a specific underlying blockchain. And I'm not sure, maybe we're going a little bit more into how blockchains are concretely used in the context of decentralized identity. For example, how EPSI has been doing it, how IOTA is thinking about it. But I'd say I'll stop talking for now because I talked a lot already, and hand it back to you, Jamie.
I mean, as you say, super fascinating. And one of the things, again, I wanted to pick up on, because we've got this kind of mixed economy of blockchains, some things on ledger, some things in the wallet, some things peer-to-peer. We've got this whole universe of different use cases that are driving different requirements. We've got this privacy and security angle that's really born of Web3, saying actually we can make the data portable, and that's really one of the powerful capabilities. But if you take the identity lens, and having worked up through kind of the start of SSI and Sovereign and Evernym and looked at the great work that's being now done at the Decentralized Identity Foundation on interoperability, there are design choices, and it reaches all the way through to the eIDAS wallet and that work on identity. Because is there going to be a kind of single identifier that makes sure we can trust the wallet, and we know where it's come from, and we can perhaps it makes portability much easier? Or are we thinking of the wallet as a way for the individual to show up in different contexts, and actually those identifiers are contextual based on the relationships? And maybe this is time to bring Alan in, because you've been thinking about that, I think, quite deeply, about those two different models, right? Do we have identifiers that are persistent, or do we have identifiers that are maybe different to relationships? And how do you think about those two different models and what that means for identity using blockchain?
Thanks for bringing this up, Jamie. Well, first we need to distinguish between legal entities and natural persons, because they're like completely different. I mean, you can think of them two different ecosystems subject to different requirements, especially when it comes to privacy. Because when it comes to natural persons, we need to protect the interactions and minimize the information exchange to the largest extent possible. But let's first start with legal entities. I think it's an easier problem to tackle. As mentioned before, like legal entities, companies, organizations, they do have multitude of different identities, and that's perfectly fine. But most of the information, if not all, is mutable. We see companies getting rebranded, companies owning multiple brands, changing ownerships, changing domain names. So once these things change, if companies issuing documents that have a lifetime longer than these changes happen, there's an issue, because the identifier or whatever was used in that document to resolve some information may no longer be available. So for this reason, some kind of a persistent or a unique identifier would be required, or it's like a nice property to have, because no matter how much information changes, it will be always easy to resolve back to the original information, and to verify that the signature that's been made 2 years ago was really valid and nothing has been really revoked. And here, I think, at least the way EBSI designed the solution is that legal entities can establish just this decentralized identifier, which is a unique and persistent identifier, then can attach a wide range of information to it. And that's it. So if name changes, if URL changes, doesn't matter. So signature verification will always be possible. We could of course talk now about like long-term, long-lived signatures with long availability. So there are many ways, but at the end of the day, you always need an anchor. So even if you embed all the information like in the signature, you still need to ensure that like the root of trust really existed at the point in time and was valid when the signature was made. So like basic anchor is needed. Now, when it comes to natural persons, the situation is quite the opposite. And bringing up EUDI and persistent identifier or not for natural person, I think this is on a critical path at the moment. At least the way we approach this so far in all the projects that we're involved is that essentially a relationship between the entity and the consumer or the issuer, it's like one-to-one. So there's no global or unique identifier. However, there's a challenge. When it comes to high assurance use cases, you would like to know the information comes from a certified wallet. Once you have a certificate, you will either, it's funny, I had this discussion today, you, you will either need to ask for each new key you create the wallet provider to issue an attestation or a certificate, or anyone else who can attest the quality of the wallet or the key, or your wallet will act like an intermediary certificate authority, and you will then use that certificate or key to issue certificate or keys for other keys you're creating within the wallet. Now, in the first scenario, is the wallet provider will learn about all the key material you have, and if something is exposed, of course, they can correlate. In the second scenario, you will create basically a unique identifier, because the certificate or the intermediate certificate that you would use to sign all your keys or new generated keys will basically be a super cookie. I mean, because you will share same certificate everywhere. Even if you add zero knowledge proof, things wouldn't change a lot if you still use conventional signature to sign the certificate. And I think here, it's always back to the Occam's razor. So let's find the solution that's easiest to implement and least painful. Let's see how it evolves. Because as Evername proved that there's a way to do this securely, but it turns out that cryptographic methods are not yet recognized. So everything is too very young, and governments want something that's stable and attested. So I guess there will be some kind of balance between complexity and maturity, and so there's always a trade-off. So, but let's see how it evolves.
And that's the magic word again, right? We're back to kind of trade-off and requirements. And when people talk about privacy, they often mean things like selective disclosure, or not sharing all the data and zero knowledge proofs. But there's this idea of kind of correlation, right? If I've got an identifier that can follow me around, and now we're back to, is it easy to deploy in high availability and secure, but we've got this unintended consequence of an identifier that can be traceable. But how do you think from an IOTA perspective? How do you think about that? Is it a trade-off? Do we have to kind of make that trade-off, or are there ways to?
Oh yes, for sure. So I agree with Ellen's take and the skepticism around natural persons. Although there is an interesting aspect that we see in everyday life, right? We as humans seem to have a desire to broadcast our identity and make it available and discoverable, right? Like otherwise, nobody would be using social networks, and the personal need to do that is varied. And I think this is what privacy is ultimately about, right? To have the choice to do that. But I think we will see identity ecosystems where a person might at least upload the identifier publicly available, have them linkable, correlatable, right? Because they want to be identified as their social persona in different contexts. This puts whoever you want to make responsible for this, right? The deployer, maybe the author of a DLT, maybe all the node runners into a weird perspective, because they might be in breach of data privacy laws by not being able to redact that information, right? So I agree that the most defensive approach is to not use on-chain and not discoverable identities, only set them up pairwise and so on, right? But I don't think that will cover all the use cases, especially the social ones, right? And we are inherently social at the end of the day. So that will be a challenge for us all to figure out. And then again, as you said, Jamie, right? From IOTA perspective, we lose history after a certain point in time, which sounds great, which sounds almost like we had the right to forgotten figured out. But as it is, everything is cryptographically verified with archival deep storage nodes. You can construct a proof that proved that 2 years ago you put something on the ledger, although it's not part of a ledger anymore. Here also the guarantees are different from DLT to DLT, right? Some have a complete state, some have partial state, some have only value transaction archive but not data transaction, and so on. It depends again. So I think like if we talk EU-centric, regulation-centric, well, don't put your personal identity on the Tangle or on the ledger. That's what it looks like at the moment, right? I think the jury, I'm not a legal expert, but I think the jury is still out if IDID should be considered personally identifiable information, right? Yeah, might be, right? And then it's better not to do it. Otherwise, keep every other information out of your DID document, right? Don't put your email in your DID document or any other endpoints that can be correlated again towards your natural identity. Just maybe one more point I want to make. I imagine a lot of use cases that we see to bridge long-living governmental identities, right? Because those will be stable identities, your social security number, the equivalent of that, right? Your national ID card, your ID card number, they will be long-lived. They will stay with you till the end of your life, right? They will be issued once by a certified authority that you might have your personal trust expectations towards, but they exist, right? And we need to deal with them. I see a lot of the use cases where we trade in basically our national identities towards credential that are then issued to the ephemeral pairwise identities, right? You need to authenticate once with a national identity to get the gym membership, and then you will get the access credential to actually access the gym autonomously on a pairwise identity, right? So this trade-in allows us to not be out there with our national identity, flashing it around everywhere, right? Making us very, very trackable. But having the providers trade in a national identity authentication towards basically a tokenized credential, if you want to look at it, right? Because the link to the national identity doesn't exist anymore. It's just they trusted that those identities are linked. The link is only visible to them through them having issued you another credential that you then can use to access their services.
A bit like Dom kind of stepping back and seeing the different responses. It does occur to me that, back to this requirements and trade-offs thing, there's privacy and correlation at a kind of blockchain level. You could have the conversation at a kind of wallet cryptography level and peer-to-peer relationships and so on, or you can do it at the kind of credential level, right? Whether that's a government ID or something else. And Dom, you've got for your sins a legal perspective in your past, and I wonder if you could share your thoughts about this idea of kind of professional ID versus corporate ID versus government, how they show up in this blockchain context, and where we think about those trade-offs for those different users, really, or different persona, whether it's a natural person or a government or an organization. How does Walt ID think about that?
Yeah, for sure, and you're right. I unfortunately got a legal background, but it comes in handy when you are thinking about governance, trust frameworks, and how new decentralized identities ecosystems are being built. I think a lot of the important topics have been covered by Alan and Ike. The fact that there are use cases, or let's say entities where we don't have any compliance issues, like organizations. We know we should be more careful with individuals. I think by now it's global consensus that you can't just put data on a blockchain, which is something that I think not too far in the past was something that was not very clear to everyone. But as you say, Jamie, there are so many different, let's say, shades and gray areas, because what if we think about, individuals in the social context, like Ike said, thinking about, your LinkedIn profile, like you want to have your professional identity visible, you want to have your social identity or your contact information visible. What do we think about more and more people becoming self-employed, being empowered by new systems where they can create things and directly monetize with consumers? I mean, in a way, we see more and more individuals becoming brands. And how do we handle this? And if DIDs are problematic, what about wallet addresses? There's lots of other issues that are coming up. Let's think about new regulations in Europe, like the travel rule, that, for example, state that, if I want to pull funds from my crypto asset service provider to a non-custodial wallet, so basically take it off the regulated, certified playing board, I have to prove that, I'm the same person. How do I do that with existing crypto infrastructure, if not using something like NFTs or SPTs, which kind of force me to do things on chain? So I think we're making great strides towards figuring this out, and I think the European Union and European Commission and member states are really driving this, as has been done with EPSI for a couple of years now, and people are figuring out. And I think, as someone said, the final decision is still out. We don't yet know. So I'm pretty sure that there will be lawsuits over time, and there will be litigation, and there will be jurisprudence that will then, at the end of the day, settle the decision on what's okay, what's not okay. How do we handle if it's encrypted? How do we handle zero knowledge proofs? I mean, I think this is also an important topic. Looking at Polygon ID, they developed this very interesting solution that combines off-chain identity verifiable credentials with on-chain proofs. How do we handle this? I think it was Ellen that said that, if we're in a government context, if we're building especially high level of assurance, or let's say just governmental identities, we have to be careful, maybe move a little bit slower, maybe just rely on cryptography and technologies that have already been evaluated or are around for a little bit longer. So overall, we see the space evolving, we see infrastructure and the plumbing being built, and we're in the middle of it. And we have the chance, with the solutions that we're building, the standards that we're shaping, to really, form the conversation and make sure that at the end of the day, everybody, be it consumers, be it businesses, get reliable solutions that just work, right? Where we have this feeling that we may have had, or that some of you also may have had when using Uber for the first time, or paying with Apple Pay. These transactions that have been super cumbersome suddenly become magically easy, like signing up for a service, or getting a loan from a bank or whatnot. So I'm not sure if I replied to your question. Actually, I hope I did. I was just rambling on and on.
No, you definitely did, and there's a thread here. We talk about requirements, and it's one of the beauties about talk about identity and wallets, and they're all these big, they're hugely horizontal things, right? They touch. We've heard citizens, we've heard government, we've heard application layer, we've heard Uber. There's private sector, there's public sector. It touches everything, and there's great work done by the Women in Identity group, saying identity for everyone. It's got to be designed by everyone, right? This is going to have to be a real participation from not just the technologists, but people thinking about governance and policy, and honestly, the social sciences. What are the ceremonies that are involved in thinking about proving who you are? And maybe that's a good point to bring Sylvia back into. You touched on refugees, and there's a real risk that we solve for the KYC bank account use case and the the portability of data with my eBay reputation, but how is Polygon ID thinking about making it work for everyone? And what are the questions we should be asking?
That's a great question, Jamie. So, as I said before, if we want to make it work for everyone, then we actually need to consider that not everyone is in a developed economy, and there are emerging markets, and then we need also to keep an eye on what are the infrastructures they have in there, and how our solution can be properly be utilized there. The good thing is that in most of the emerging economies, the infrastructure around mobile technology, internet connection is usually already quite good. So whatever we are nowadays developing, I think could be from an infrastructure perspective, could be developed in there and could be used. Completely different stories, the level of trust the individuals have on sources of trust, right, for their identities, and that's where we need to think about how to be able to provide identities to people that currently don't have it, and that they don't rely maybe in their own governments on having an identity being given, right? So we need to think about of these edge cases, so to say, and be able to gather all of them. We have been focusing a lot on privacy, right? But what we have realized is that privacy seems not to be the most important topic for most of the people on the ground, so to say. We have developed solutions based on ZKPs and so on. But actually, as Dominic and Ike were mentioning before, nowadays people really like to be public in most of their aspects in their life. So whenever we come into reputation and we want to make our good reputation public, right? So then you don't need this ZKP technology at all, the other way around. And even there will be also solutions that will allow that your data is public on a blockchain as soon as you provide the consent to do that, right? So if you provide the consent, why not? That the different strains, what will happen with that data in the long term. But I think we need to be able to combine the different types of technologies to be able to bring different solutions depending on the use case we are working on. And I think the most important thing to tackle here will be the interoperability, right? Because probably not everything will work on a single identity solution. And we need to be able to talk to each other, to be able to also exchange information between different chains. So it's about the solution of the identity solution itself and the infrastructure being used to make use of it, right? So, and that's where I think we really need to still work a lot on that. We have a long way to go, although we have been working already for some years around it. And I think what we really need to do a better job still is on the usability, on the user experience. So at the moment, I believe people that are more used to handle their cryptographic keys, then they are not scared about making use and creating their identity, keeping the keys or the seed phrase to recover that. But not everyone is really capable to do that, right? And we actually need to, and I know there is work in progress. We need to be able to provide other solutions to be able to let everyone in the world to be able to use their own identity, manage it, or let a third party manage it, right? So if it's based on keys. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I think the way I see it is there won't be a unique identity solution across the globe. It's almost impossible, right? And so the different solutions probably need to talk to each other and have this interoperability, as well as be able to leverage on the different technologies that are being used in the background. Could be a blockchain, could be this or the other blockchain, could be a different type of database, and we will probably need to build bridges in order to communicate and be this data related to your identity available wherever you want, with whom you want.
I'm loving this conversation because it's really bringing together what I think has been a kind of decentralized identity, self-sovereign identity conversation for like 10 years nearly. And we're into requirements, we're into privacy, we're into trade-offs, accessibility, UI. Dom, you mentioned governance, and it's a really condensed version of that conversation. And the thing I want to really bring out in what you just said, Sylvia, was on the ground, like the requirements that matter about the utility of it as much as the privacy side of things. And Nick, how do you with from an Ethereum ecosystem perspective, there's a Web3 crypto, not your keys, not your crypto baggage, and way of thinking about wallets and tokens. And to what extent, is privacy the big thing? Is that the main thing that, in the Ethereum ecosystem people are thinking about? Or how do you see, privacy playing in as a hard requirement? Or is it something that actually might need to be traded, as I could put it earlier, in favor of some other utility?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, it's definitely a big topic, and it's one that's not fully solved, obviously, but I want to kind of go back to something Sylvia brought up, the concept of consent in this space. It's a concept that we think about a lot, and it comes up in things like selective disclosure and other technological solutions. And to a certain degree, a lot of the technological solutions around consent are somewhat solved. We have good tools for them. But there are other sort of like softer solutions that are less solved, things like UX, because there's consent, but there's also informed consent and there's enthusiastic consent. There's different things that consent can be. And so there's a lot of products out there, especially really in the Ethereum ecosystem, that kind of have good, like the technology is there to allow users to consent, but they're not necessarily doing a great job of educating the users on what they're consenting to. Have you ever used like an Ethereum dApp and you didn't necessarily realize that this information you were putting out there is out there forever? So I think that if you're an application developer or even an SDK developer to a certain degree, you have a responsibility, number one, to absolutely try as hard as possible to minimize the PII that you ever put on chain. You should, that should be a huge focus if you're developing a system. Spend a lot of time figuring out how I can get this thing that I thought should be on chain off chain. And then when you do have things that need to be on chain, how do you educate the users and allow them to actually make an informed decision of if they want to, participate or how they want to participate in that? And I think that's really the user choice is what matters.
Can I press you on that? Because I guess it's that we're burdening the consumer now, the citizen, right, with choices that maybe they don't fully understand what indelibly written to a global ledger means or what the implications are. Yeah. Like, to what extent? I saw a great thing written the other day saying, don't trust the map, trust the map maker, right? And to what extent are the architects in this field, your colleagues on this call, responsible for thinking about what the implications are and where the dangers might be or opportunities? How do you think about that?
I think we have a responsibility to think through it deeply. I think there are maybe some people in the ecosystem that might be more libertarian, idealistic on this, and they say, oh, it's the user can just decide whatever they want to do. I don't need to worry about this. I leave it all up to them. But you have to be realistic, and you have to understand that we are people who study this stuff for years, and so we're obviously going to know a lot more about it than the average consumer. We're able to make informed decisions that they're not able to make. So you have to really provide that kind of education, and that's really tough because I go sign up for a new application, some kind of cool social network thing that my friend just told me about. I don't want to have to be taught how it works. I just want to start using it, but there has to be some kind of middle ground there where there's like a slow onboarding process or something that educates you a little bit about how the system works before you make that decision. But to get to your original point about the not your keys, not your crypto philosophy, I think there's definitely something to that, and I think that it's really important that we build ecosystems that minimize trusted third parties as much as possible. And ideally, there's a version that has no trusted third parties in certain ecosystems at least. But at the same time, you want to give users the choice where I can say, oh, I don't want to manage my keys. That sounds really boring to me. I don't care. I'm perfectly willing to entrust some huge multinational corporation with this because I know that they have a track record of protecting user data in certain ways if they do. So it's not like everyone has to be the decentralization maximalist. People can pick and choose what level works for them, and that's where things like being able to use whatever DID method works for you in a system and allowing the application doesn't really have to care about that because DID methods provide that interoperability for us. So giving users as much choice as possible and educating them as much as possible are like the unsolved challenges to me.
I think at some point this is also a responsibility of regulators, right? That they set a backstop at some point of things that are just definitely not acceptable, right? Because the trust, as you said, And I think that's valid, right? We trust our banks with quite a lot of information, quite of sensitive information, right? But I believe, and that might be cynical, right? But I believe the reason they take very good care of that is probably not purely self-motivated and self-interest, but because they are forced to do so, right? And I think that will translate to the DLT space to some extent. It's hard, right? It's very, very hard because identifying liable parties gets complicated very, very, very quickly, right? And there will be unstoppable things, and unstoppable things will be going unstoppably wrong in some cases for sure, right? But I think a regulatory backstop is essential if we talk about privacy, right? Because this is also, besides choice, what it's actually anchored in. Right? If we talk about, and from a European perspective, what is data privacy, that is defined through regulation, and they may also try to make the trade-offs as best as they can between valid use cases and invalid use cases.
And I think maybe that's an excellent point to kind of wrap up on, in the sense that, you know, there are governance bodies that are going to have to think about these trade-offs, and from the commercial side of things and the policy side of things, and it touches on the user experience and patterns and consent flows. It touches on the technical standards and how they make sure they think about open and not closed, and some of those trends that have maybe been challenging for us over the last 15 years about how Web 2 has maybe pushed things in a direction we didn't like. So maybe just to wrap up, I'd love to ask you all one question, which is what excites you most about identity and thinking about decentralized identity using blockchain. But if we go around, so Sylvia, I'll start with you. Maybe what would you say that is you're excited most about the future?
Well, it's the amount of use cases where, well, it's not even use cases, it's the new doors that the use of decentralized identity brings to the people, and we are just empowering people, right, to make use of their own identity. And we need to get there. We need to improve a lot in, as I said before, in certain aspects. But that's what I feel it's amazing about this technology.
Fantastic. Alan?
For me, it's very simple. I love solving problems, and this is one of the toughest ones that's not related to physics. So.
Very good. Eike?
Lately, definitely deriving trust in complex systems. I think this is the next challenge for the identity ecosystem, to figure out how that is supposed to work.
Brilliant. Nick?
I'd say I'm mostly interested in replacing sort of like social applications with community-owned protocols, returning to the world of RSS and getting away from the world of Twitter way of doing things. And I don't think there's any way of doing that without DID.
Very good. And maybe we'll finish with Dom.
Yeah, I'm going to build on Alan's and Nick's points. So what fascinates me is that, you know, the internet was built without three very important things: encryption, payments, and identity. And, you know, the first two things are, I'd say, more or less solved, but identity isn't. And ultimately, what decentralized identity does is it brings users, or enables users, to ultimately have a choice. You mentioned portability, Jamie. I think that's at the heart of everything. If we are in control of our information, of our data, there won't be lock-in effects that will, you know, result in power imbalances that just drive us to use applications that we don't want to use. And so I think identity will ultimately empower everyone on the planet. And it's definitely one of the biggest challenges that we can work on today.
What a fantastic way to wrap up. So it just leaves me to say thank you to our panelists and for making the time for this important conversation, and for covering such a kind of broad range of topics, from governance to UX to policy, and really what an optimistic note to end on about the opportunities for decentralized identity using blockchain. And with that, we'll wrap up. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.